On the afternoon of September 13th, 2017, Emily Carter was doing something completely ordinary. She was driving east on Interstate 10, making the 6-hour trip from El Paso to Austin to visit her cousin for the weekend. Her playlist was queued, her gas tank was half full, and she'd just texted her mom that she'd be stopping for a quick break near Sonora, Texas. It was one of those messages that doesn't feel important at the time. Stopping for gas, all good. That would be the last text anyone ever received from her. Around 4:07 p.m., her silver Honda Civic pulled into a weathered gas station off exit 392, a rural rest stop surrounded by dusty brush, a half-broken vending machine, and a single overhead light that flickered when the wind picked up. Emily pulled up to pump 2, parked, left the engine running, and walked toward the building. Her image was briefly captured by the station's aging surveillance system, the timestamp blinking in the corner, as she stepped into the convenience store, glanced toward the register, and headed toward the restroom hallway. That was the last confirmed sighting of her. When the station attendant was later questioned, he remembered her vaguely. A young woman, alone. He thought she looked tired, maybe road-weary, but polite. She had nodded toward him when entering. He didn't recall seeing her leave. That wasn't unusual. People came and went all day. The store wasn't busy, and he was distracted by a vendor call when she walked in. He never saw her walk out, and neither did the cameras. Investigators would discover later that the camera covering the front counter and entrance worked, but the angle aimed down the restroom corridor had a large blind spot. The video showed Emily walking in, but nothing after that. No exit, no return to the pump, nothing. Her car remained at the station, still parked beside the pump. Keys in the ignition. Driver's door unlocked. Her phone was nowhere in sight. Her purse was missing. The fuel tank was never filled. 2 hours later, her cousin grew concerned when Emily didn't respond to a text asking for an ETA. An hour after that, her mother began calling, first assuming the call dropped, then beginning to panic when it went straight to voicemail. The first missing persons report was filed at 9:41 p.m. that night, and local sheriff's deputies responded quickly, dispatching a cruiser to the gas station address. The deputy found the car exactly as described. The engine had long since cooled. No signs of a break-in, no blood, no drag marks. Nothing suggested a violent struggle. It was as if Emily had simply evaporated from the property. The gas station's owner, who was called to unlock storage areas and cooperate with the search, insisted nothing like this had ever happened before. Officers combed the small building and surrounding lot with flashlights, calling out her name. The women's restroom was empty, spotless. The store was quiet except for the hum of refrigeration units and the buzz of a failing ceiling light. There were no customers, and no signs of forced entry or damage anywhere on the premises. By dawn the next day, the Texas Department of Public Safety issued a bulletin, and Emily's disappearance made local headlines. A soft-faced, brown-eyed 19-year-old with no history of mental illness, drug use, or criminal behavior had vanished during broad daylight. Flyers were printed, search parties organized, drones scanned the nearby brushland. Dogs were brought in to track her scent from the car to the store and lost it at the restroom hallway. Her bank cards showed no new transactions. Her phone last pinged at a tower just south of Sonora at 4:12 p.m., aligning precisely with the footage timestamp of her entering the building. After that, no trace. Her parents drove in from El Paso that morning, stunned and confused. Her mother sat in the station parking lot in a folding chair for 3 days, asking strangers if they'd seen her daughter. Her father walked the highway shoulders with a flashlight until his feet blistered. Law enforcement kept the building closed for 48 hours, scanning the septic tanks, roof crawl spaces, and nearby culverts. They questioned the only 2 other people on site that afternoon, a delivery driver who dropped off soda crates and a man who pumped gas 2 stalls over. Both were cooperative and cleared. Neither remembered seeing Emily. The longer investigators stayed, the stranger it felt. No one had seen her walk out. No one heard anything. She simply disappeared inside a public place, in broad daylight, with no evidence left behind. As days passed, the working theory began to splinter. Had she willingly left with someone? Had she had a mental break and wandered into the wilderness? Had someone lured her into a vehicle in the blind spot? Yet each hypothesis left unanswered questions. Why leave behind her phone and car? Why vanish mid-trip without contacting anyone? Why here? 6 days after her disappearance, a K-9 team was flown in from Houston and led a controlled search of the 1.5-mile radius surrounding the rest stop. Nothing. A week later, a group of volunteers sweeping the nearby mesquite fields found a discarded water bottle and fast food wrapper, neither traceable to Emily. Her case was escalated to state-level missing persons. The FBI became involved due to the possibility of interstate abduction. Yet with no digital footprint, no eyewitnesses, and no physical evidence, the case began to cool. In interviews, detectives admitted they were baffled. In the timeline of that day, one window stood out: 6 minutes of blind surveillance between 4:12 and 4:18 p.m. Within that window, Emily Carter vanished. Her car remained. Her destination was never reached. Her name joined the growing list of missing persons lost to unexplained silence. And for 6 years, the gas station restroom remained just another stop on a long highway stretch, until someone opened the vent. The first place investigators turned was the surveillance system. The gas station's cameras, though outdated, had captured a full front view of Emily's car pulling in. The timestamp showed 4:06 p.m. Her silver Honda Civic glided up to pump 2. A minute later, Emily stepped out, phone in one hand, keys in the other, and walked across the cracked concrete toward the front door of the station. A second camera, positioned just above the counter inside, picked up her entering. She turned toward the restrooms located at the back left corner of the store. The footage was clear: her distinctive denim jacket, tan backpack slung loosely over one shoulder, and her dark hair tied back. She moved quickly, like someone who just needed a quick stop. That was the last time she was seen. What came next would confound everyone. There was no footage of her leaving, no image of her exiting the restroom, no recording of her walking back toward the pumps. Nothing. Investigators paused the footage, rewound it, slowed it down frame by frame, and reviewed every possible angle from every functioning camera. Emily Carter had walked into the building, into the restroom hallway, and then seemingly vanished. When they checked the hallway camera, they realized something immediately. The system had a blind spot. The camera meant to monitor the back corridor didn't have line of sight to the women's restroom door. Its lens caught the corner of the men's room and a sliver of the hallway wall, but not the door Emily had entered. There was no motion sensor, no backup angle. For all the equipment's presence, it had failed at the single moment that mattered. The lead detective, an officer named Linda Moreno, pushed for a full forensic sweep. She wanted every square foot of the property reviewed: the restroom, the hallway, even the locked staff closet nearby. But the initial walkthrough yielded nothing. No signs of forced entry, no broken locks, no blood, no dropped belongings. Inside the women's restroom, the tiles were clean, the trash empty, the stall doors functional. It looked the same as any gas station bathroom on any highway in the country. A uniformed officer stood at the restroom entrance while techs dusted for prints, collected swabs, and photographed every corner. Still, no usable evidence emerged. Even the restroom door had only Emily's prints, along with those of dozens of other travelers. The station owner, a man named Patrick Voss, cooperated but was visibly agitated. He swore the security system hadn't been touched in years. The cameras had been installed in 2008, and though he admitted they were due for an upgrade, he insisted they worked as intended. When asked if anyone had access to the digital recorder, he said only himself and a technician who came every 6 months for maintenance. The footage files hadn't been tampered with. There were no gaps or signs of deletion. The critical failure wasn't foul play. It was design. The system simply hadn't been placed to capture the one area now central to the entire investigation. Word spread quickly. The story of a teenage girl vanishing from a public restroom with no evidence sparked regional headlines within 24 hours. Flyers went up across Texas. Social media exploded with speculation. Amateur sleuths began breaking down camera angles and theorizing everything from abduction rings to inside jobs. Meanwhile, law enforcement was stuck. They brought in canine units again. The dogs tracked Emily's scent from the car to the store entrance, then faintly down the hall, and lost it entirely past the restroom. It was like she had entered a vacuum. They checked the HVAC system, climbed into the attic crawlspace, and swept the septic tank. Everything was clean. Detective Moreno personally reviewed 3 years of station employee records. She conducted interviews with past and current staff, including a night janitor who had worked the evening shift the day Emily vanished. He remembered cleaning the restroom just before she arrived, said nothing looked off. She asked him about strange noises, blocked vents, odd smells. He shrugged, hearing nothing, seeing less. She took down every word anyway. With no new leads, the case was classified as a high-priority missing person investigation. State troopers expanded the radius. Divers were called to inspect a shallow irrigation canal behind the station. Nothing turned up. Every tip the department received turned into another dead end. A report from a waitress in San Antonio who believed she saw Emily eating alone at a diner ended up being another young woman with similar hair. A truck driver claimed to have seen a girl hitchhiking near Ozona, but the timeline didn't match. Other tips turned darker, suggestions she'd been trafficked, or worse. Her parents were forced to navigate the brutal fog of possibility. Every day, Emily's mother called the lead detective, sometimes to offer a memory, sometimes just to ask if anything had changed. Moreno wished she had more to give. A month in, and there was still nothing definitive. No DNA, no personal items recovered, no eyewitness accounts. Just a 6-minute gap on surveillance footage and a bathroom that gave nothing back. As public interest surged, media attention poured into Sonora. The gas station was inundated with reporters and curious travelers. Eventually, the store was forced to close temporarily, both to preserve the scene and protect the staff from harassment. Graffiti scrawled across the back wall read, "Where is Emily?" But Moreno's biggest concern was time. The longer someone was missing, the lower the odds of recovery, and in this case, there was no evidence to even point a direction. Behind closed doors, officers debated whether Emily had left willingly, been taken by force, or suffered some unknown medical episode. Yet every theory collapsed under scrutiny. She didn't drive away. She didn't call anyone. She didn't leave any sign of distress. By the 3rd month, with no progress made, a subtle shift occurred. Resources started to shrink. Media moved on. New cases arrived. But one thing remained unchanged: the blind spot. The unanswered moment that sat like a wall in the investigation. A 6-foot stretch of hallway that swallowed a person whole. That flaw in the camera's view would become the focal point of conspiracy theories, family grief, and professional obsession. Because that's where Emily Carter stopped existing on record. That's where the evidence ended. That's where the story began to turn cold. Emily Carter's disappearance didn't remain a local mystery for long. Within 48 hours, her name was circulating on statewide news broadcasts. Her photos splashed across morning shows and urgent online threads. A cropped senior portrait, her in a navy sweater, smiling slightly, brown eyes tired but kind, became the face of a growing campaign. Her family refused to let the story fade. Her mother, Deborah, launched a Facebook group that gained 10,000 members in less than a week. Her father, Mark, printed flyers and drove the entire I-10 corridor between El Paso and Austin, pinning her image to gas pumps, truck stops, church bulletin boards, any surface that might catch someone's attention. A GoFundMe page was created to support private investigators, and podcasts started picking up the case. Yet for all the attention, none of it translated into answers. The timeline was airtight. Emily left El Paso around 10:30 a.m., texted her cousin at 1:47 to confirm she was on the road, and checked in with her mother around 3:40, saying she was making a stop for gas. GPS data pulled from her Google account traced her journey with precision. Her route didn't deviate. She hadn't taken any side roads, made no unexpected stops, or shown signs of suspicious behavior. Her location history froze at 4:12 p.m., a ping from the gas station's coordinates that aligned exactly with the timestamp of her entering the building. Then, nothing. Her phone stopped transmitting data entirely, not just turned off, dead. No background activity, no further location updates. It was as though the device had ceased to exist. For her mother, that detail was the most chilling. Deborah couldn't accept the idea that her daughter simply walked away. Emily was meticulous. She texted if she'd be late. She sent selfies from rest stops. She had friends, a job at a campus coffee shop, a tuition deposit already paid for spring semester. Nothing about her behavior leading up to that day suggested she was running from something. Deborah stood in front of news cameras and said it plainly. Her daughter had been taken. She believed Emily was still alive, being held somewhere, waiting, and she refused to give up until she was found. But Mark, Emily's father, took a quieter view. He had served in the army, had seen things he didn't talk about, and couldn't shake the feeling that something in his daughter had shifted lately. She'd been unusually quiet in the weeks before the trip. He remembered a call where she said she was just tired of being on all the time, that sometimes she wished people didn't expect so much from her. He didn't think she meant anything by it then. But now he wondered, had she hit a breaking point and chosen to disappear? Had they missed a cry for help? As the investigation stalled, the internet filled the void. Reddit threads dissected her last known movements. TikToks theorized human trafficking, citing Emily's appearance and the isolated location. Others suggested more elaborate plots, a serial offender using the station's blind spot or a former employee hiding in the walls. A darker corner of online discourse accused the family of staging the disappearance for attention or of covering up an honor killing. Law enforcement dismissed most theories, but the rumors kept spreading. People wanted a villain, a pattern, anything to make sense of how a young woman could disappear into a bathroom and never come out. Investigators held firm to their evidence, which was frustratingly incomplete. No financial activity since that day. No witnesses at any point along the highway recalling a hitchhiker or suspicious driver. No highway patrol reports. No receipts. Even Emily's social media account sat frozen. No logins, no outgoing messages. Her friends described her as grounded, funny, someone who planned her meals and color-coded her calendar. The idea that she would abandon that life without notice didn't align with the person they knew. Still, Detective Linda Moreno considered every angle. She met with a clinical psychologist specializing in adolescent behavior. The expert suggested that while most disappearances at Emily's age were voluntary, this one felt different. Too abrupt, too clean. Runaways often left digital breadcrumbs, reached out eventually. The complete silence here was disturbing. Moreno agreed. She kept circling back to the restroom, the one location they couldn't fully account for. But with no physical evidence, no sign of a struggle, and no trace left behind, she was stuck. She requested funding for further forensic analysis of the building, but was denied. The station had already been searched multiple times. There was nothing else to find, or so they believed. Meanwhile, the family tried to keep Emily's face in the public consciousness. They organized candlelight vigils, hired private search teams, and even brought in a psychic. A television crew filmed a short documentary interviewing Deborah inside Emily's childhood bedroom. Her desk remained untouched. A planner sat open on the page for September 14th. It read, "Arrive in Austin by 6, dinner, Dabous, Kelsey." Chill. A small smiley face had been drawn next to it. After 3 months, tips slowed. After 6, the case began to fall out of the headlines. The Facebook group stayed active, but with fewer posts. The gas station quietly replaced its exterior signage and updated its cameras. The restroom, once a site of daily foot traffic and speculation, returned to its anonymous routine. Travelers stopped, filled their tanks, used the bathroom, and moved on. Occasionally, someone would recognize the place, take a photo, or ask the clerk if they knew about the girl who went missing. Most didn't. By the 1-year anniversary, law enforcement classified the case as inactive but unsolved. There were no further leads to chase. The file was boxed, labeled, and shelved. But for the Carters, nothing had stopped. Deborah still drove to the edge of Sonora every few weeks and sat in her car near the station, watching people come and go. Mark had started drinking more, his nights spent in the garage tinkering with old projects he never finished. Their house grew quieter, and Emily remained missing, her last confirmed step frozen in a hallway that had offered no answers. A hallway where the silence refused to break. Nearly 12 months after Emily Carter disappeared, the case file had gone cold. Officially, it remained open, but for all practical purposes, it was dormant, relegated to a dusty cabinet, occasionally referenced when a tip came in or a new detective reviewed past cases during downtime. One of those detectives was Brian Castillo, a transfer from Bexar County who had recently joined the Regional Investigations Unit in Sonora. He wasn't assigned to the Carter case directly, but the file caught his eye late one evening. There was something about the timeline, about how clean the disappearance was, that didn't sit right with him. A girl walks into a gas station restroom and never comes out. A security blind spot, a dead phone, and no exit footage. He found himself reviewing the footage again and again, staring at the frame where Emily walked down that hallway and vanished. On his next day off, Castillo drove the 40 minutes out to the gas station by himself. The business had changed owners, but the structure was largely the same. Castillo filled his tank and walked inside, ordering a coffee he didn't want. The store clerk, a teenager with headphones in, didn't recognize the name Emily Carter. When Castillo asked about the old restroom hallway, the boy just shrugged and waved toward the back. The moment he stepped inside, Castillo noticed something strange. The women's restroom, though small, seemed disproportionate to the external blueprint he'd reviewed in the file. On paper, the restroom area should have taken up less than 8 feet in depth, but standing inside it, shoulder to the far wall, Castillo measured closer to 11, 3 feet, unaccounted for. That number rattled in his head the entire drive home. He pulled the original site blueprints the next morning. The station had been built in the late 80s, and renovations were poorly documented. There was no mention of structural expansion in the past decade, and no plumbing modifications that would explain thicker walls. Still, Castillo's concern was dismissed internally. A bathroom with a thicker-than-expected wall wasn't cause for a full forensic sweep. But he kept looking. He requested historical permits, city planning records, even employee rosters that predated Emily's disappearance. When that didn't give him answers, he filed a formal request to bring in a cadaver dog unit. 2 weeks later, with limited fanfare, a canine team from Junction arrived for a quiet walkthrough. The dogs were experienced, used in both recovery and criminal scent detection. They were led through the building during off hours, walked past the pumps into the hall, and finally into both restrooms. Nothing, no alerts, no signs of human decomposition. The lead handler noted the dog seemed uninterested inside the building. Still, Castillo wasn't satisfied. The air inside the women's restroom felt too still. The acoustic echo was off, like it absorbed sound differently than the men's room next door. When he knocked along the far wall, he noted a hollowness near the top corner that didn't match the rest, but he had no legal grounds to dismantle anything. His next move was unofficial. He contacted a local plumber he trusted, someone he'd worked with years ago during a separate investigation involving hidden compartments in a storage facility. The man agreed to visit the gas station under the pretense of inspecting faulty drainage. With management's permission, they examined the restroom's piping and surrounding walls. No signs of clogs, no leaking or tampering. The ventilation shaft looked intact, just dusty and neglected. The plumber noted that the vent's placement was odd, set unusually high above the toilet stall, almost against the ceiling. But again, there was no damage, no forced entry, nothing that would legally justify deeper exploration. Despite the lack of support, Castillo couldn't let it go. He started spending more time at the station, sometimes just sitting in his car in the parking lot during lunch. He re-watched old footage from similar disappearances, cross-referenced every unsolved missing person within a 100-mile radius, and scanned missing persons databases late into the night. The more he pulled, the more he became convinced that something had been overlooked, not in the broader area, not along the road, but in that building. Specifically, that restroom. He compiled a 30-page internal memo highlighting the inconsistencies in the structure, including timestamps of maintenance logs, personnel schedules, and blind spots in the floor plan. The memo was reviewed but ultimately shelved. No new evidence, no active leads, no permission for demolition. By the spring of 2019, Castillo's insistence had become a point of friction. His supervisor advised him to focus on active cases. His request to reassign resources to the Carter file was denied. He was reminded that cadaver dogs had cleared the scene, that nothing had changed in over a year, and that his theory was built on speculation. Eventually, he was pulled from the case entirely. A new missing child in San Angelo required urgent manpower, and Castillo was reassigned. Still, in private, he continued to visit the station whenever he passed through. He walked into the women's restroom, stood silently, and looked up at the corner where that vent was mounted, dusty, rusted, and untouched since the day Emily walked in. He never spoke publicly about what he suspected, not in interviews, not in retirement, but he never forgot. Because in all his years on the job, no case had ever felt quite like this. No bathroom had ever felt so wrong, and no wall had ever felt so full of silence. Luis Garcia had never forgotten the smell. He wasn't the kind of person most people remembered. He worked quietly, arrived early, left late. He didn't make small talk, didn't ask for overtime, didn't complain about the heat or the long hours or the broken vending machine that never got fixed. From late 2016 through early 2020, he worked on and off at the gas station off exit 392, sweeping floors, changing light bulbs, mopping bathrooms. He'd seen 4 different managers come and go, teenagers who stole candy, truckers who fell asleep behind the building. But the one thing he never stopped thinking about was that smell in the women's restroom. It was faint, always faint, sour and earthy, almost like wet wood left too long in a closed-up shed. It clung to the tile grout and the corners of the ceiling no matter what he used to clean it. He remembered asking about it once, back in 2018, maybe 2019. The manager shrugged and told him to bleach it again. That was always the answer. Bleach it again. But Luis remembered what happened before the smell started. In September 2017, the girl had gone missing. Emily Carter, 19. He remembered her photo on the flyers. He remembered the detectives walking through the store, the questions, the hallway being taped off. He remembered standing outside the restroom door, wondering if they'd find something. They didn't. They searched the septic system, the roof, even behind the mirrors. But the official story was that she'd walked in, and somehow no one ever saw her leave. Luis didn't know her, hadn't worked that shift. But after that day, something was different in that bathroom. And he was the only one who seemed to notice. Years passed. New owners bought the place. The security system was finally updated. Most people forgot. Occasionally, a traveler would ask if this was the station where the girl disappeared. But that was rare. By 2023, the Carter case had all but vanished from public memory. It had been 6 years. The world had moved on, but the smell hadn't. Luis, now working part-time elsewhere, still came in once a week to help clean on Sundays. The new manager appreciated his consistency. When renovation plans were announced that spring, full bathroom demolition, new ventilation, new tile, Luis offered to help. Said it was easier to have someone familiar with the layout. Really, he just wanted to see it taken apart. On a Thursday afternoon in May, during prep work, Luis was tasked with removing the old wall vent in the women's restroom. It sat above the last toilet stall, barely hanging on, rusted at the corners. He'd cleaned around it dozens of times, sprayed it with air freshener, wiped away the cobwebs. But he'd never opened it. Standing on a ladder, he took his screwdriver and began removing the top screw. It was stripped, took some effort, but came loose. The second one turned easily. As he loosened the third, the metal plate shifted slightly. Not enough to fall, just enough to reveal a sliver of darkness behind it. He paused. The smell was stronger. He leaned closer and nudged the plate outward. That's when the screwdriver hit something soft. He pulled back, heart skipping. For a moment, he thought it was insulation, maybe a bird's nest. But the texture wasn't right. Carefully, he reached into the opening with his gloved hand and felt something. Fabric. Worn. Brittle. He pulled gently and revealed a strip of denim torn at the edge, faded blue with a smear of something dark near the seam. Beneath it, wedged into the narrow cavity behind the drywall, was something metallic. He pulled it out, a class ring. Heavy, dulled by time, but the initials were still clear. E. C. Luis stepped down from the ladder and didn't speak. He walked outside, asked the contractor to call the owner, then stood near the back of the building without saying a word. When police arrived 2 hours later, they cordoned off the bathroom and began carefully removing the vent housing. Behind it was a narrow crawl space sealed between drywall layers, no more than 10 inches deep at its widest point. Inside, they found more fabric fragments, remnants of paper, and what appeared to be claw marks scraped into the inner wallboard. Everything was bagged, photographed, and sent to the state crime lab. One of the responding officers recognized the name on the ring before the evidence tag was written. Emily Carter. The next day, forensic teams returned and began removing sections of the wall. The smell, mild but undeniable, intensified as they worked. Behind the insulation, buried beneath a layer of dust and decay, they discovered partial remains. Not enough for full identification on site, but enough to confirm human presence. The wall had concealed a pocket of space never intended for storage, a structural defect, or perhaps something created during an old renovation. And someone had used it. Luis didn't return to work the following week. He gave a statement, answered questions, and then went home. When a reporter showed up at his apartment asking for a quote, he declined. He didn't want credit, didn't want to be part of the news cycle. All he said was that the smell had never made sense, that it was always there, year after year, no matter how hard he scrubbed, that something in him just didn't let it go. The truth, he said, was that he didn't know what he expected to find behind that vent. He just knew no one had ever looked. In the weeks that followed, the Carter family was notified. DNA tests confirmed the identity. Media outlets returned to the old story. Body found in restroom wall, they said. Break-in 6-year-old disappearance case. Luis's name was rarely mentioned, but inside the police department, everyone knew that it wasn't the texts, the dogs, or the cameras that solved it. It was the janitor, the one who never forgot, the one who always knew that something, somewhere, had been left behind. The vent cover was removed carefully, pried loose inch by inch as crime scene technicians surrounded the stall where Luis had first reached through and touched the frayed denim. The smell, once described by Luis as earthy and strange, was stronger now, no longer subtle, but sour and invasive. Behind the rusted frame, beneath a layer of dust and insect husks, was what remained of a denim jacket. Time had stripped it of color, but the stitching on the inside tag was still faintly visible. It matched a brand confirmed by Emily's parents during the original investigation, one she wore regularly, seen clearly in the last surveillance footage before her disappearance. A dark stain spread across the left shoulder seam, long dried and oxidized into something rust-colored and faintly metallic. Investigators collected it immediately and flagged it for expedited analysis. Then, nestled deep behind the lower corner of the vent opening, wedged between a screw bracket and a rotted beam, was a class ring. Dull silver. Purple gem. The initials E.C. etched into the underside. It was the first physical trace of Emily Carter found in nearly 6 years. The gas station was shut down within hours. Caution tape cordoned off the front door. Vehicles lined the service road as forensic specialists, detectives, and local deputies filled the parking lot. The bathroom was sealed off. Workers removed the remaining vent housing and began cutting into the wall. Layers of plaster, drywall, and the old insulation peeled back under gloved hands. What they found behind the panel wasn't a simple hollow. It was a man-made cavity, less than 2 feet wide, running vertically from the baseboard to the ceiling. A void, sealed off from both sides, never visible unless deliberately opened. Inside that narrow shaft, the temperature dropped slightly, and the dust grew denser. but it was the scratches that silenced the room. Near eye level, faint but unmistakable, were claw marks. 5 parallel lines etched into the inner drywall, carved by fingernails or something sharp enough to leave the surface marred. The marks varied in depth. Some were shallow, like panic-driven, scraping. Others dug deeper, revealing the gypsum beneath the paint. Technicians paused. Photographs were taken. Blacklight analysis followed. Then they found it, half a fingernail, embedded near the base of the cavity. A crescent fragment, broken clean through. It was stained with old blood, barely recognizable, and buried in a layer of insulation that had not been disturbed since installation. The surrounding walls bore no entry points, no maintenance panels. Whoever had been in that cavity hadn't entered it by accident. As word spread, the story reignited in national media. Emily Carter's name trended across social platforms. Old threads on Reddit lit up with speculation. News vans pulled into the gravel lot. The gas station, once a routine pit stop in the middle of Texas, became the center of a reopened investigation with one question dominating every headline. Had she been there the whole time? The absence of a body made it harder. For now, the discovery was classified as circumstantial. But to law enforcement, it was undeniable. The jacket, the ring, the fingernail, all found in the exact location of her last known movement. A 6-year-old disappearance, previously stagnant, had just pivoted into a probable crime scene. Still, the uncertainty gnawed at everyone involved. Where was her body? Could someone have hidden it there, then returned later to move it? Or, an even darker possibility, had she died in that wall? The original lead detective, Linda Moreno, came out of early retirement to consult. She was briefed on the findings, given access to the updated forensic files. Her reaction, according to a colleague, was one of restrained devastation. In 2018, she had pushed for a secondary structural scan of the restroom wall, believing the layout was off. That request had been denied. She'd let it go. Now, years later, her worst fear had resurfaced. The cavity was real. The signs of struggle were real. And someone had missed them. Investigators mapped out how such a space could have been used. A local contractor reviewed blueprints from the 1980s and confirmed that the wall had likely been hollowed out during an undocumented plumbing reroute. It wasn't part of the original design. No access panels existed. From the outside, the space was invisible. From the inside, the only possible point of contact was the vent, the same one placed awkwardly high above the stall. Investigators believed it could have been used as an entry point under specific circumstances, if the wall behind it had been compromised or if someone had created a false passage during maintenance. Either way, it was never meant to be found. DNA results on the fingernail fragment were prioritized. Within 72 hours, the lab confirmed it was a match to Emily Carter. That confirmation, while not conclusive in a legal sense, was enough to formally reclassify her case from missing person to suspected homicide. The location of the body remained unknown, but the implication was clear. Emily hadn't left the building. She had been trapped inside it. What investigators had once considered an impossible disappearance now appeared to be a prolonged death behind drywall. The scratches confirmed she had tried to get out. The fingernail said she had fought. The bloodstain on her jacket confirmed she had suffered, and no one had heard a thing. Journalists camped outside the property. Commentators speculated endlessly. Theories resurfaced. Had she been lured, tricked? Was someone else inside the station that day? Someone who had access to that wall, to the crawl space, to the vent? The vent, which sat just feet above where she'd been last seen, became the focal point of renewed suspicion. Former employees were contacted, work orders re-examined, and all eyes shifted to who had worked maintenance during that time. Someone who knew the layout, someone who had keys, someone who, in theory, could move between walls unnoticed. And buried in those old employment logs was one name that kept coming up. A name no one had thought to question. A name that, in 2017, had quietly vanished from the payroll just days after Emily did. The day after the class ring and jacket were recovered, the demolition team returned with a full forensic directive. Investigators had secured a warrant to dismantle the bathroom wall in its entirety. Not just the panel near the vent, but the full structure, from floor to ceiling, tile to stud. What they uncovered wasn't a random void or a construction mistake. It was something deliberate. Behind the drywall and insulation was a second wall, a false utility partition constructed roughly 16 inches behind the visible restroom wall. Between the two, hidden in the dark, was a narrow corridor that extended several feet downward and continued at a low angle behind the structure. A tight, claustrophobic space, neither room nor tunnel, just wide enough for a person to squeeze through on hands and knees. At first, investigators believed it might be a forgotten service channel, possibly from an earlier phase of construction. But blueprints from the city records told a different story. The crawlspace didn't appear on any version of the official floor plan, neither the original from the 1980s nor the modified one submitted after the plumbing updates in 2005. And yet, it was there, physically present and undisturbed for years. The entrance to it was barely accessible, requiring someone to hoist themselves up through the vent opening inside the restroom stall. The distance between the top of the toilet and the vent was nearly 6 feet. There was no platform, no step. Whoever had used it had either planned for it or knew exactly how to get in. The passage stretched along the back of the building, running behind the employee break room and a storage unit filled with old supplies. Investigators followed the narrow space until it opened slightly, revealing a sealed door. On the other side was a small, unmarked maintenance closet accessible only from a locked hallway near the rear exit. To anyone walking past, it looked like a janitor's room, unremarkable, cluttered with tools and shelving. But now it was clear. The closet was more than it seemed. From the inside, it served as a secondary entry point to the hidden crawl space. Whoever designed this had created a private passage through the building, a silent, concealed tunnel running behind walls that thousands of customers had passed without ever knowing it was there. Technicians swept the crawl space for biological evidence, hairs, fibers, anything traceable. The walls bore signs of long-term human presence, scrape marks, aged scuffing, even a piece of torn fabric matching the jacket found in the vent. Heat signatures were negligible, meaning no one had entered in recent days. But one thing was clear. Someone had been inside at some point. Someone who knew how to move through the structure undetected, and someone who knew the restroom vent wasn't just ventilation, but a passage. Attention turned to the station's employee records. Names were reviewed, schedules reconstructed. Surveillance logs from 2017, though incomplete, were reanalyzed to match workers on site the day Emily disappeared. And one name stood out, Leonard Griggs. Listed in personnel files as a part-time maintenance contractor, Griggs had worked irregular shifts at the station between 2016 and early 2018. He had no direct supervisor, only loose reporting requirements. He came and went freely, often after hours. Payroll confirmed he had received final compensation on September 20th, 2017, exactly 1 week after Emily vanished. The timing was too precise to ignore. A deeper background check revealed Griggs had no criminal record, no red flags. But neighbors from his old address remembered something odd he'd left in a hurry, moved out of his rental home and abandoned several tools in the shed. When asked why, his landlord said Griggs claimed he'd found something better and didn't give forwarding information. He'd never returned for his belongings. His contact information was outdated, cell number disconnected, email addresses dormant. It was like he had erased himself. Detectives tracked him through employment history, finding a temporary listing tied to a maintenance firm in Oklahoma. No recent tax returns, no driver's license renewals. But a bank account in his name had remained quietly active, used only for small purchases. It was enough to confirm he hadn't died. He was simply hiding in plain sight. Surveillance was issued, and a nationwide alert placed on his identification. Inside the crawlspace, techs continued their work. They discovered a discarded flashlight wedged behind a pipe, battery long dead. Next to it, a scrap of cardboard with faint indentations, possibly pressure marks from something once resting there. The implication was disturbing. Someone had spent time in this space. Enough time to set objects down, enough time to wait. The team reconstructed the most plausible scenario. Emily had entered the restroom. The crawlspace door was open, or opened soon after. She was lured or forced through the vent, unwilling or unaware. Once inside, she was trapped in the wall cavity, sealed behind drywall. The rest played out in silence, undetected by anyone in the store. She'd tried to escape, left scratches, torn her jacket, and someone, most likely the person who built or maintained the crawlspace, had returned later. Cleaned just enough, sealed the space, resigned, disappeared. Investigators couldn't say exactly how long she survived inside that wall. But they knew one thing. She hadn't simply vanished. She had been hidden, purposefully, in a space that wasn't supposed to exist, by someone who knew no one would ever look there. And for 6 years, they hadn't. Now that someone was out there, still alive. And if he could build a passage like this once, there was no telling what else he'd planned to never be found. He was found in Tulsa, Oklahoma, living under his real name, working night shifts at an industrial supply warehouse just outside the city. Leonard Griggs hadn't legally changed his identity or made any effort to disappear on paper. He paid rent in cash, drove an old Ford pickup with expired tags, and lived in a converted garage behind someone else's home. When authorities finally approached him, he didn't run. He answered the door wearing a tool belt, holding a cup of black coffee, and stared blankly as the agent showed him the warrant. He said nothing as they placed him in cuffs. The local police didn't even know the full weight of what was being handed to them, but back in Texas, they did. DNA found on a section of drywall inside the hidden cavity, skin cells buried under paint flakes, had come back with a hit. Leonard Griggs, former maintenance worker at the gas station off exit 392, was now the prime suspect in a 6-year-old disappearance that had haunted investigators, devastated a family, and left a permanent scar on a quiet stretch of highway. The first interrogation lasted nearly 3 hours. Griggs didn't deny knowing Emily Carter. In fact, he remembered the day she came in, September 13th, 2017. He was finishing some after-hours electrical work and had been up in the crawl space, repairing what he called ventilation inconsistencies. The wording caught the lead detective off guard. When asked what he meant, Griggs clarified that he'd sometimes access the vent system from the inside, not from the roof, but from the cavity behind the restroom wall. He said it was easier that way, quieter. He insisted he hadn't meant for anything to happen. But eventually, the words started to come out, and what he said stunned even the most seasoned officers. According to Griggs, the crawl space had always fascinated him. He didn't build it. He claimed it had already existed when he took the job, but he maintained it, kept it clean, used it occasionally to stash tools or take breaks. It was hidden, soundproofed, and no one questioned him because he had keys to everything. On the day Emily vanished, he was inside the wall, adjusting the upper vent fan above the women's stall. He noticed when she walked in. He admitted, slowly, that he had watched her. Not the first time, he said. He had done it before. But this time, Emily saw him. She looked up, locked eyes with the vent, and realized someone was behind it. Griggs claimed he panicked, climbed down through the maintenance side of the crawl space, came around through the employee entrance, and intercepted her as she was leaving the restroom. He said she was furious, demanding to speak to a manager, threatening to call the police. That part, investigators believed. Emily wasn't someone who kept quiet when she felt wronged. Griggs told her the manager wasn't in but offered to let her use the office phone in the back hallway. Instead, he led her toward the maintenance closet through the hidden crawlspace access. He told her it connected to the office. She hesitated, but he insisted. Said it was the only other phone in the building. Once she was inside, he said, she realized it was a lie. When she tried to leave, he shoved the door closed, locked it from the outside with the utility latch. He said he told himself it was temporary, that he just needed time to think, that he'd let her out when he calmed down. But he didn't. He walked out the back, drove home, and never returned. He quit the job by phone 3 days later, told them he had a family emergency. No one asked questions, no one came looking. And as the investigation stalled, Griggs disappeared into a different kind of silence. He told detectives he didn't know how long she survived. That part, he said, still haunted him. He never went back, never opened the door again. He didn't want to know. When asked why he never turned himself in, he went quiet, just stared at the table and mumbled, "I thought it would stay hidden." And for a long time, it did. What he hadn't counted on was the janitor, the smell, the years of quiet persistence from a man with no badge, no authority, and no intention of letting the memory fade. The forensic report confirmed the rest. Trace amounts of biological matter inside the cavity, skin cells, hair, blood, matched both Emily and Griggs. The scratches on the drywall matched the width of her fingernails. The half-broken nail embedded in the plaster had her DNA on one side and his skin cells on the other. Prosecutors began drafting charges before the confession was even complete. First-degree murder, false imprisonment, criminal tampering with evidence. There would be no plea deal. Griggs was transported back to Texas within 48 hours. News of the confession broke nationwide. Emily's parents, who had lived in a suspended reality for over half a decade, were notified in a private. The press waited outside their home, but they didn't speak. A family friend issued a statement on their behalf, thanking law enforcement, the community, and the janitor who never gave up. But behind closed doors, grief returned in a different form. Not the uncertainty of absence, but the certainty of what had happened. Emily hadn't run away. She hadn't been trafficked or abducted by strangers. She had been locked in a closet by a man who was supposed to fix broken things. And no one heard her scream. The final detail came out during an evidence hearing, one that would never make the news cycle but would stay with every detective who worked the case. A crime scene technician had reviewed Luis Garcia's original statement, the janitor's notes about the smell. She had annotated it with a simple line from the autopsy report, that the level of skin sloughing found in the wall cavity and the chemical signature from decomposition aligned with the approximate window Griggs had described. Emily hadn't died immediately. She had likely survived for up to 48 hours, trapped, alone, and just feet from people walking past. The smell that haunted Luis wasn't imagination. It was her, trying to be found. They found her late on a Thursday afternoon, behind the last panel of drywall at the very end of the crawl space. Her remains had settled under layers of insulation, splinters of broken wood, and a collapsed duct pipe that seemed to have given way years earlier. Her body wasn't intact. Time, heat, and the compression of that small, airless void had taken its toll. What the coroner recovered was partial skeletal remains, some fragments of fabric, and a phone, crushed, warped, and silent. But no one questioned who she was. The forensic tag said Jane Doe for the chain of custody, but the team already knew. This was Emily Carter, the girl who had vanished without a trace, the girl the world had stopped looking for years ago, the girl who, for 6 years, had been lying just a few feet behind a wall that hundreds of people had walked past, completely unaware. The space she had died in wasn't meant for people. It was narrow, unfinished, filled with jagged screws and bent piping. The original structure plans didn't even show it existed. Investigators determined it had been created accidentally during a reconfiguration of the HVAC system in the late 90s, then later modified without a permit during one of the station's quiet renovations. It wasn't part of any official blueprint, and unless someone was looking for it, it was virtually impossible to detect. The only way in was through the high wall vent inside the women's restroom stall, a vent Griggs had used as his personal access point. It had sat 6 feet above the toilet with no obvious utility. Just a rusted, oddly placed grate that most people never looked at twice. But behind it, through a narrow cut in the wall, was a crawl space leading into that hidden pocket. It was in there, behind those walls, that Emily had spent her final hours. The phone they recovered didn't power on, but the tech team extracted what they could. No calls, no texts. The signal had died as soon as she was trapped, but the screen had several fingerprints, smeared, overlapping. A few notations in the cache data showed the flashlight had been toggled multiple times. Investigators believed she had used it to try and find her way out until the battery gave out. But it wasn't the phone or the position of the body that broke the investigation open. It was the walls. Scratched into the inner drywall were words, not many, not dramatic. They weren't even carved deeply, just faint impressions made with fingernails and eventually blood. But they were deliberate. The most visible was etched in shaky block letters beside a rusted bolt. Hello. Underneath it, slightly curved and stretched from where her arm would have reached upward. Can anyone hear me? Further down the wall, closer to where the remains were found curled into themselves, was a final phrase, scratched so faintly the team used UV powder and angled lighting just to make it out. 4 words. Someone will find this. The room went silent when it was read aloud. A crime scene photographer, on his 43rd documented homicide, walked outside and threw up. The technician cataloging the evidence cried quietly while she cleaned her gloves. One of the detectives requested to step off the case, because that phrase wasn't just a message, it was hope. Hope left in a space where there had been none. Hope written by someone who was dying, not knowing if she would ever be found, but writing it anyway, believing it, trusting that someone, someday, would open the wall and read it. And they had. The coroner estimated Emily survived between 36 and 48 hours. Her cause of death was listed as asphyxia due to environmental entrapment and oxygen deprivation. Heat inside the cavity rose quickly, especially during daytime hours, and insulation had muffled both sound and air movement. She had banged on the pipes. They could see the dents. She had scratched the vent from inside. They found marks on the inner housing, but no one heard her. The wall had been too thick, the insulation too dense. To anyone inside the restroom, she was just gone. The vent, her only connection to the outside, had been overlooked by every officer, every technician, every passerby. Until Luis. The autopsy report included another detail. Half of a fingernail embedded in the wall matched the fragment found months earlier. DNA confirmed it belonged to Emily. The position of the body, curled, protective, as if she'd been trying to shield her face, suggested she didn't go peacefully. She'd fought, she'd tried, she hadn't given up, even when the air grew thin and the dark grew thicker, and she hadn't wasted time with pleas. She left a record. The team sealed the crawl space after the recovery. The gas station, now permanently closed, would be demolished. No memorials, no flowers. Emily's family requested the site be torn down, replaced by a public safety station or anything that could serve someone rather than hide something. Her remains were cremated in a private ceremony, and the ring found near her jacket was placed in her mother's hands during the service. There were no news crews, just family. Just closure, if you can even call it that. In the weeks that followed, podcasts reignited, documentaries pitched production deals, and people online dissected every new update. But none of it captured what investigators knew to be true, that for 6 years a girl had been dying behind a vent no one had thought to open, that her final thoughts weren't revenge or despair, but a simple hope that someone, someday, would find her. And they had. Not in time to save her, but in time to hear her. And now, after all those years, she wasn't lost anymore. The discovery sent shockwaves across the country. News anchors led with it. Girl found in gas station wall 6 years after vanishing. Images of the old station off exit 392, now gutted and cordoned off, looped on national broadcasts for days. Commentators debated how it could have happened, how so many missed it, how something so horrific could remain hidden in plain sight. Investigators gave statements, officials issued apologies. But one name kept surfacing again and again: Luis Garcia, the janitor. The man who, despite everyone forgetting, despite being told nothing was there, hadn't stopped noticing, hadn't stopped asking. It was never his job to solve a missing persons case, but in the end, it was his hands that reached into that vent and brought Emily Carter home. Luis never asked for recognition. He declined interviews, refused book offers, turned down a televised award ceremony. When pressed by a reporter outside his apartment complex, he simply said, "I just knew something was wrong." His statement to police was 1 page long. No theatrics, no speculation, just a quiet account of what he smelled, what he saw. and what he couldn't forget. Law enforcement credited his persistence as the sole reason the case broke open. Without him, they admitted, the wall likely never would have been opened. Without him, the truth never would have surfaced. Luis Garcia, who spent years cleaning a restroom no one wanted to think about, had become the reason a 6-year mystery finally ended. In the weeks that followed, Emily's family organized a private memorial. The gas station had been demolished within days of the body being recovered. All that remained was a cleared patch of dirt surrounded by temporary fencing. They didn't want a permanent marker, not a shrine, not a place for gawkers, just one day to reclaim what had been taken. Her parents stood in the center of the field, surrounded by family, friends, and a handful of detectives who had worked the case in its early days. There were no TV cameras, no microphones. Emily's mother stood with a small piece of drywall in her hands, the same one pulled from behind the vent. The writing was faint but still visible. "Someone will find this," she read it aloud, her voice cracked. Then she said something no one forgot. "She didn't give up on us, so we couldn't give up on her." Later that month, Leonard Griggs was sentenced in a Texas courtroom. He didn't fight the charges. His public defender entered a guilty plea on all counts: false imprisonment, second-degree murder, evidence tampering. The prosecution declined to seek the death penalty, citing the family's request for a swift resolution. Griggs received life without the possibility of parole. During sentencing, he never looked up. He gave no apology, no statement. When the judge read the sentence, Emily's father closed his eyes. Her mother didn't flinch. The courtroom remained silent until the end. As Griggs was led away, one of the detectives whispered, "He thought silence would protect him, but her silence was louder." Public response to the case led to swift policy changes across several states. The gas station chain where Emily disappeared issued a public apology and announced a new initiative: emergency alert systems installed in all single-use restrooms across their 800 locations. Each bathroom would now be equipped with panic buttons, ventilation motion sensors, and structural scans during inspections. Other chains followed. Legislation was proposed mandating safety features in public facilities. One senator called it the Emily Standard. Another called it a reminder of what negligence can cost. But the real shift happened outside the courtrooms and policy memos. It happened in the homes of people who had stopped believing that one person could make a difference, that stories end when no one's watching, that victims without a voice stay silent forever. The final detail came during a re-examination of the crawl space, days after Griggs's conviction. Forensic analysts had been conducting a final sweep, removing remaining insulation and cross-checking evidence logs. That's when one technician, cataloging damage to the interior side of the vent shaft, noticed something near the top edge, carved faintly into the metal brace. It wasn't deep and most of it had rusted over, but under magnification, illuminated by angled light, the letters became visible. 5 characters, uneven but unmistakable. ALIVE. She had written the word alive. The technician called it in quietly. No press release was issued. The family was notified in private. For them, it was more than evidence. It was a final message, a timestamp, a confirmation that Emily, in her last conscious moments, still believed she could be saved. She hadn't given up. Not in the first hour, not in the first day, not even as the air thinned and the dark closed in. She believed someone would find her. She believed the world wouldn't forget. That word, scratched into rusted metal, reframed everything. It wasn't just a plea. It was a fact. She had been alive, and no one knew. In the end, that single word, more than the courtroom testimony, more than the timeline or the footage or the forensics, was what haunted people most. Not because it made the tragedy worse, but because it made it real. Emily didn't vanish. She wasn't abducted into mystery. She was right there, leaving behind proof in places no one thought to look. She fought. She waited. And eventually, someone did find her. Not a detective, not a journalist, a janitor, a man no one had listened to, a man who just couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. And because of him, she isn't a headline anymore. She's not just a statistic. She's not a missing girl. She's a name, a daughter, a voice behind a vent, and now, finally, a voice that was heard.